Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
A deafening silence, forgotten British murder. In a decade of researching and writing about crime, Simon Farquhar has met many of those professionally or personally affected by it. They all carry with them stories the rest of the world has forgotten, but to them remain unforgettable. Did I say that Simon joins us live on the line? Good morning to you, Simon.
Morning, Giles.
Good to have you with us. Explain a little bit about sort of your background and what gives you a particular insight to write the book A Deafening Silence.
Well, there's quite a strange story behind this book, actually. My late father was a policeman, a senior policeman, and the last case of his career was a very famous serial killer case in the 80s called the Railway Murders. After he died, I wrote a book about that case, which was a way of sort of paying tribute to him and sort of investigating, his working life and so on. And I'd always had an interest in crime anyway, obviously from growing up in his son. And that book did well. And then I wanted to write another one. I wrote about a case, quite a famous case called the Muriel Mackay case. And over the course of, altogether, that was sort of 7 or 8 years, I'd obviously met a lot of people who are, police officers, people who work in the legal system, and so on and so forth. And you just get a lot of stories from those people. Quite often, particularly with police officers, you say to them, how do you cope with the things that you deal with on a day-to-day basis? And are there things that just have stayed with you for one reason or another? And they always end up telling you some story, and then some of those stories then stay with you for reasons that you can never really quite work out. Out of every 5, one of them just sort of, stays there sort of at the back of your mind. And so it was coming up to 10 years since I wrote Dangerous Place, which was the book about the railway murders. And I just thought it would be nice to sort of gather some of those stories together, all of them, none of them would be a book on their own. They were sort of smaller case, if you want, smaller in practically and obviously emotionally. And when I started to think about the ones I wanted to write about, I was interested to try and work out why these ones had stayed with me. And they were all cases that had never been written about before, certainly not substantially. They all took place roughly around the same sort of period in Britain, between sort of the late 60s and the mid-1970s. And the other thing about them was that I thought that there was a good reason for each of them to go into the book, not just for the sake of remembrance of the victims, but also because in one way or another, they all said something about the society that we live in, how it's changed, how it still needs to change. They just all seem to have some sort of reason to be told again. So that was it. That was how it came about.
It's interesting, wasn't it? Because there is a fascination with crime. If you go onto it's a staple of television. Every time you turn on the TV, there will be a crime journal or something. True crime podcasts are high ranking. People devour crime novels, especially true crime. But we like to think, and excuse the pun, of open and shut cases. So there is a verdict, the criminal is brought to justice, we shut the case and we move on. Unfortunately, yes. Real life isn't like that. Real life is messy and complicated and stays with us, sometimes through decades, sometimes through generations past those lifetimes. And I think
it's absolutely right.
Yeah.
And that's one of the main planks of the book, is that I wanted to look at these stories and stay with them after everybody else had gone home, after the press had packed up, after the criminals had gone away. What is left remaining? Because a crime committed against one person has countless victims. It spreads, the misery and the horror of it spreads out for generations to come. And when you meet people who have been victims of crime years later, to them it's like it happened yesterday, even though there might be no trace left anywhere else apart from in some old newspapers. To them, they're living that all the time. So I was particularly interested to tell the stories that never get told, like what happened to the criminals afterwards, what happened to the father of the victim, and what happened to their school friends and things like that. Those stories to me are really where the merit in it is, because you see patterns in that. You see one of the most extraordinary things in this, although I always try to make these stories obviously victim-centric, there was one particular case in this where, as I was researching it, something unfolded which was completely unexpected, and it was a story of a terrible tragedy that happened in a Christmas tragedy that happened in the countryside years ago. And the two men responsible for it both got life imprisonment in 1971. And I wanted to know, what happens after you've committed a crime like that, after you come out? Do you reform? Do these people rebuild their lives? And one of the two men had died in 2009. But the story of his life in the 20-odd years he'd been released was very powerful. The other one I just could not find any trace of. And I imagined that he'd changed his identity and so on. And I always had this idea that eventually I'd track him down and meet him in the corner of some bar in a satellite town somewhere and give him 50 quid and say, just tell me your story. That never happened. The reason was I eventually found out that the reason why I couldn't locate him was because he was still in prison for that murder 46 years later, which I think makes him the longest serving prisoner in Britain today. And he then died. And the Home Office allowed me to see his entire prison records going back 45 years. And the story they told was remarkable because it not only showed you how societal attitudes to criminals had changed from 1971, where there was very little understanding or very little advancement in psychology and so on and so forth, to now when there is a much more, dare I say it, civilized penal system. But what was extraordinary was that you just saw how much dedication and how much effort had been made over the years by good, well-meaning people to try and understand him and his crime and to try and move him to a better place. And it was all a complete waste of time. He never had any remorse. He never had any empathy. He sabotaged every attempt that was made to try and cooperate with him and so on. So that, again, was one of those, unknown stories. And by the end of it, towards the end of his life, advances in criminal psychology had become so much more sophisticated that some insight was finally gleaned into maybe this is the sort of thing that can cause someone to do something like that. And if nothing else, there is hopefully a value in making a finding like that public.
That also brings up the thing of if you have spent a considerable time in an institution, you become institutionalized. And therefore the fear, because if he goes in at 71, he's presumably a young man, he knows nothing. He cannot form he's already damaged because of what the terrible crime he's done, but the actual fear of going outside into a world, talk about a time capsule between 1971 and perhaps 1991 is an entirely new world, and all he knows.
And also the arrogance that sort of criminals like that have is that they're delusional into thinking they can just walk out again. And of course, these people have never, they've never dealt in decimal money. They've never used a cash machine. They've never, but that's a kind of example of the sort of arrogance and entitlement to think, well, I can just leave now, and everything will be absolutely fine.
It's interesting as well. You talk about that when the spotlight moves on, when the case moves on, we know this happens. And one of the most, when they doorstep, when the journalists doorstep, and they're looking for the quote, something horrendous has happened, somebody goes missing. They always say, there's always a neighbour, and they always say, this doesn't happen in a street like this, in a town like this. They were normal people, and we tend to think that in somehow the victims or people who are involved in crime will have some inkling this is going to happen, and it doesn't, and it comes out of nowhere, and bam, suddenly you have police turning up, and most of us don't have dealings with the police on a regular basis, and most of us certainly don't have dealings with the media on a regular basis. So that's a complete, and in the middle of this huge trauma that something horrendous has happened to a family member or a close friend, you're scrambled. That's the word put. Your defense, your reactions are scrambled, and then almost as suddenly, it's gone. And we expect people just to say, okay, well, wasn't that interesting? And pick up the Daily Express and make a cup of tea. And again, life is messy and complicated.
That's right. And interestingly, some of the stories in the book are about people who seemed so unlikely to be capable of committing a crime like this, and in places which was so unlikely. I mean, the last story in the book, which I saved to the end because I say in it, this is the strangest story I have ever been given. And I was told this story via a completely different route 15 years ago. And when you're a writer, people do tend to say to you sometimes, oh, I've got a story that you should tell. And, most of the time it's important to them, but there isn't a great deal of leverage in it. But on this occasion, someone told me a story and I was absolutely, I was thunderstruck. And I remember some years later telling someone about this, and they said, why on earth have you never written this down? This is incredible. And I said, I've never found a home for it. That story, which extraordinarily has connections with David Bowie and the music scene of the 1970s, which I still can't believe I'm the first person to actually finally tell it properly. That is one of those stories where everybody involved, when the truth came out, just simply could not believe that this could happen. And I still don't understand how that could happen. But when you try and piece together these kind of histories, what you tend to find is that all the component parts of them are scattered far and wide. You know, people have dispersed all over the place, and documents and so on have dispersed. And when I was looking into that, I found someone who was living a long way away. And I went to see him and said, just tell me everything you know. And he said, well, you might be interested in this. And he produced a box which contained letters, diaries, photographs, confession notes, everything. I mean, it's just, you know, to a writer, that's just a gold mine. And I thought, this is it. I finally got the whole thing. And even though piecing it all together, it begins to make some semblance of sense, you still step back and think, but I still just can't imagine how someone could get to the point where they decided to do that. Honestly, that story is absolutely extraordinary. One other thing I would say, though, it's curious, is that there is one story in the book which took place in Leatherhead in Surrey, so about 15, 20 miles out of London. And the strange thing about that is that it was triggered by a man playing golf one evening, and he knocked his golf ball into the rough. When he went to look for it, he saw a bone lying in the ground and realised it wasn't an animal, it was a human one. It was a hand, and it had rings on the finger. And the police were called, and it became clear that a fox had obviously dragged this from somewhere. So they set about a massive search, and they eventually found his body in a shallow grave. And it had been there for 3 years, and no one had ever reported this person missing. And so a huge appeal went out. Is anyone missing a relative, woman aged about 40, so on and so forth? And hundreds of people wrote in saying, well, I came home from work a couple of years ago and my wife had gone. There's no explanation, never seen her since, you know. And all those statements have survived. None of them pointed to the dead woman. And I actually took some time to look into those, because one of the common denominators with those was the incredulity of people going, I thought my marriage was perfectly happy, and my wife just vanished. And sometimes there would be a note next to them in the file from the woman in question saying, no, I'm alive and well and living in Kilburn, but I just don't want my family to know where I am. So you never know about that. So those little tragedies of people going, I can't believe this has happened to me, are kind of microcosms of what it's like to be a victim of crime. But the other thing that's really extraordinary about that is that the area where that body was dumped and found, I talked to a local historian, and she said to me, it was the one time she said, there is nothing surprising about this happening here, because this area for centuries has been an area where things that aren't wanted get dumped. It's a borderland between London and Surrey. It's a murky area. It's the first bit of woodland you hit when you drive out of London, and it's the last bit you hit when you drive north towards London. And she said, bodies get dumped here. There are 5 mental hospitals here. It's a place where you put things you don't want. She said, we've had 9 cats. All of them have been dumped from cars. So that became another sort of layer of history, that this area, which is just traditionally where things get dumped. And there's an extraordinary aside in it about one of the witnesses to the story, a tramp who'd lived in the woods there for 30 years. Again, an unwanted person. Those sort of things, when you uncover those, when people give up their time to explain things like that to you, are just fascinating. Because, no one's surprised. It happens all the time here. That's extraordinary. That's like a historical and geographical muscle memory, isn't it? That is basically. Yes, that's right. And she was saying to me, this is a very dark landscape here. It's not like most of Surrey, which is beach and very sort of pretty. And that this is dark oak and clay, so it's murky. And I've always been a great believer in this, the way that certain places sort of attract certain behaviours. But that was a remarkable sort of moment in there. So it was huge fun investigating that. One of the other stories is actually took place in a mental hospital in London in the late 60s, and that was interesting because it shone a light on how we dealt with people who'd had breakdowns in those days and so on. And in fact, the family of the victim, when I located them, there was nothing known about him. There was nothing in any of the evidence. He's been in here for 20 years. He's an old man and he got killed by an inmate. And when I finally approached them, they did not want to discuss it at all. And, you have to be very careful with people because you know that this is going to come out of the blue and all that. But then when we started talking, they sort of said, well, maybe his story should be told, maybe. And then they became very cooperative, and we were able to lay down for the first time who he was, how he ended up there, and how he came to this really tragic end. And the reason that he ended up in a mental hospital for 20 years is something that you today would probably just be signed off work for a few weeks for, because we understand so much more. But in those days, people were just shut away.
Well, here's the thing is that we're looking at that from a 21st century, 2020 perspective. But if you're going to the late 60s and early 70s, that's my childhood. I mean, that's when we grew up. We are those Generation X's, Simon. And you will imagine. I mean, the way that. Again, it's not all life on Mars. I mean, I know that takes sorry about the Bowie reference, but it takes that sort of look. It was all sort of flares and get in the back of the van. But I remember like the Black Panther and the Yorkshire Ripper happening to my mum and her friends, and this is in that area because we were living in the Midlands. We come from the Midlands, and there was that great disquiet because there were no mobile phones, there was no social media. The only way you get this is TV and media. And again, the way that the media reported on these things was sensationalism. It was, where are we going? Because you have that generation of the war, and they're seeing things happening in the 70s, and they are reporting in the sensational way of this evil. What is this evil? And that is the way that they reported. And we talk about today's media, but it was just as bad in the 70s and the 60s.
Oh, it was. I would say it was worse, actually. I would say the media was much more intrusive in those days. There was certainly no regulation in the sense that there is now, and I mean all sorts of tricks were got up to by one of the big differences with the media in those days was that the rivalry was so strong. So to outdo each other on a scoop, because these days a story goes on the wire and every media outlet has it, but in those days if one newspaper could get an exclusive interview with someone, the others didn't have it, so therefore you had to buy that paper, which really sharpened the claws of the media a lot. The other thing which I think which was for me very important in this book was that we have also, like you say, a perception of the police in those days, which can be very, very gung-ho and very kind of brutal. And the truth of the matter is it's just not like that. It's much more complex. There was, rather like there are today, there were brilliant police officers and there were very insensitive police officers. And most of these stories deal with some pretty impressive policing, actually, some pretty emotional ones. And, you have to remember these people are human too, and they get really affected by these sort of things. So to sit down with some of these people and say, I mean, one of them, for the David Bowie story, as I call it, when I sat down with that officer, he said, that is the most bizarre case I ever worked on. And he said, I knew that one day someone would write to me and say, can you tell me about this? So, yeah.
And here's the thing, because we seem to think, we think of our police officers as well, depending on your take on the police, but again, it's the fact we can close the door and walk away. And I've spoken to psychiatrists who've interviewed some in the States, who've interviewed some horrendous people, including Ted Bundy, and they say it stays with them. It's not a job that you can show. I've spoken to crime forensics who see the most horrendous things, and even because you have to have empathy as a police officer. I don't care what anybody says. You have to understand that you go to understand people. And even if you leave the job, you will still have that training. But even if you leave the job never leaves you.
No, that's right. And I mean, one of the most moving things in there I remember was a letter that the father of a victim wrote to the local newspaper after the case was over. And one of the things he wanted to thank all the local people for their floral tributes and letters of sympathy. And he said, thanks to an efficient and highly humane police force, which has helped to ease us in our grief, And I thought, I mean, that's a man taking the trouble to write a letter of thanks when his world had been destroyed. But I just thought those words were very well chosen, a highly efficient and humane police force. And this was 1971, So it's, life's never as simple as that. I also thought it was very interesting that in that story that was based at Leatherhead, that's a story with an extraordinary conclusion, because the man who committed that murder and murdered a woman by a brutal battering and then dismembered her and buried her in the woods got 3 years. Got 3 years for manslaughter. And I wanted to know why. How could this happen? And it doesn't go, and I say at the start of it, this is not an easy story to tell, because the stereotypes that we think about in crimes like this don't work here. This is a much more complex matter. But what I was amazed by was the way that the courts, the judge, the jury, and the police officers involved were very open to the fact that this isn't an open and shut case. We have a perception sometimes that the law is just interested in getting a result and the best result they can possibly can. I was really impressed by the fact that no, there are other things to consider here rather than what sort of result we can boast of. So, and the reason for the title, really, A Deafening Silence, was because there was two reasons for it. One is because when someone loses someone to crime, that empty space that is left behind, you can never avoid. It is like a silence which is deafening. You're constantly reminded of the life that person's been robbed of, and in such a terrible way. But the other reason for it was because there are never any answers when people ask the question, why do these things happen? There's certainly no good answers. The truth of the matter is that most of the time, the reason why people get murdered are the most banal, pointless, stupid reasons in the world. In crime fiction, murder is normally the result of a very complex plot which has been worked out by a killer, and it takes a genius detective to unravel it. And that's a comforting thing for us because we think, well, as long as we don't get involved in something like that and we don't know anyone that's that sort of evil genius, then it's, that we're going to be safe. But in real life, the majority of people in prison for murder are there for something which is completely pointless and didn't improve anyone's. As I say in there, it's to cause so much pain for so little gain.
Because it's somewhat comforting to think, in crime fiction, there's some evil genius or there's something behind that or some Machiavellian plot or something. Yes. Whereas the reality is, it's a misspoken word. It's a casually thrown punch in a pub past midnight. It is just, that is the thing. And if you go and you sit in a court and you see people come in, that is what you, the majority is what you see, not some genius. What was the reaction of people though? I just want to ask you this, Simon, if I may. What's the reaction of people when you come and you say, look, I want to tell your story. I know that you lost your partner, your son, your daughter, or this case that you just get it after all these years?
It's a good question, and everyone's different. It's a very, very, very tricky area. Sometimes the most common reaction is that people do not want to talk about it, but then if they trust you, if you win their trust, and obviously they'll look and see what else you've done and see if you generally can be trusted with these sort of stories. And then something begins to happen of like, maybe this can be laid down in a respectful way and so on. There's a danger, though. There's a danger that by revisiting this or by laying it out, that people think they are then going to get some sort of closure, which they're not. The story can be put into context, but it won't necessarily bring them closure. And you always have to make that aware. My father, as a policeman, I remember finding this out, that he would say to the families of murder victims, he said, one in particular, he said, I will do everything in my power to find whoever did this, but there's one thing I can never do, and that's bring your daughter back. And he'd said that because for years he'd realized that families would actually think once the person was caught and once there was a trial and a sentence, that everything was going to move on, and then they would realize, why do I not feel any different? So he always had to warn them, don't put faith in us to do anything more than just put this person away. And it is kind of the same with telling that story. I mean, the last book I did, the Muriel Mackay one, I had a good relationship with the family in that, and I did the most that I could do, and I was told I'd done it, was they said, you've made her a real person, which I was really pleased about.
Because this is the thing, isn't it? Because we tend to the focus goes on the perpetrator rather than the victim in 9 times out of 10.
Yeah, that's right. And I think if you have to put your victim at the centre of the story and the impacts of them, because they're the people that we can relate to. We can't relate to the criminals. So making them the centre of it is always going to be a phony exercise because you're just trying to second guess what they do. And then it becomes voyeuristic and suspenseful and so on. I think also with telling a victim story as well, you then get it then becomes much more apparent how much life was curtailed, how much they've been denied, and so on. You're telling their story up until the point that it's just cut short. And I remember when I was writing the book on the railway murders, that one of the victims in that was a young girl called Marcia Tambosi. She was only 15 at the time. She was a year older than I was at the time. And I remember visiting the place where she was killed, and there was a fork in the road, and she was on her bike, and her parents had told her not to cycle through the shortcut through the woods, which she did. and she got killed. And I remember as I stood at that fork in the road, I thought if she'd gone this way, she'd be 50 years old now. And, you can only really it sounds an obvious thing to say, but it's really when you stand in those places that those sorts of sensitivities really sort of, come to you. And they're the things that have to be the center of your story, and once you've worked that out, and that comes in things like the title you give to it and that sort of thing, this is the point, this is the core of what I'm trying to say here, So you have to talk about the criminals. You do have to do that. But 9 times out of 10, they're not as interesting anyway as stories, but you desperately want to just try and understand. And there are certain common denominators, like I say, stupidity is a common denominator. In fact, one of the policemen I interviewed for this book, and I said, all they killed her for was in case that she told someone. And he said, stupid. Apart from everything else it is, which is deplorable and evil and cruel and so on, it's just stupid, which is a pretty lousy reason for anyone to lose their life,
The book is called A Deafening Silence, Forgotten British Murders. Simon, if people want to find you online, where's the best place to find you?
I do have a website which is called Dreams Gathering Dust. So it's www.dreamsgatheringdust.com. And anyone who wants to can contact me through that.
And you can also order the book online via our own virtual bookstore. The book is called A Deafening Silence, Forgotten British Murders by Simon Farquhar. Simon, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you this morning.
And you, thank you.